so much for taking time out of your morning for this. Obviously, we are going to be discussing and reflecting on and getting our marching orders in response to the horrific shooting that happened on Tuesday, and also all the massive tragedies that have been happening over the last few weeks. And of course, seems like a constant barrage. Before we start and introduce the speakers today, I just wanted to quickly take a second, and I know it's hard, but actually just read the names of the people who were shot and killed on Tuesday. So we have Nevea Bravo, Jackie Casares, who was 10, Jose Flores, who was 10, Eliana Garcia, who was 10, Irma Garcia, who was 46, Uzziah Garcia, who was 8, Amira Joe Garza, who was 10, Javier Lopez, who was 10, Eva Mireles, who was 44, Annabelle Rodriguez, who was 10, Alexandria Ania Rubio, Leila Salazar, who was 10, Jalila Nicole Silguero, who was 10, and Rogelio Torres. Obviously, a huge tragedy, unbelievable, so many children who were murdered. And so we just wanted to take a second and acknowledge those folks who died for no reason in their school. Today, we're lucky to have Congresswoman Gabby Giffords and Peter Ambler, the Executive Director of Giffords, to talk to us a little bit about what they're doing, to give us a state of play right now on what's being done to try to ensure that tragedies like what happened on Tuesday never happen again, and hopefully to give us a little inspiration and encouragement, because I know a lot of us are feeling a lot of despair right now, and fear and incredulity, and just kind of like lost. That's how I feel. I feel kind of lost. Like, how does this keep happening? Why does this keep happening? Why is it happening in our country? And what can we actually do to stop it, to stop this senseless violence? So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Peter to say hello and welcome all of you, and give us a little bit of context. Peter, over to you.
Thank you so much, Manny. To you for your leadership in the Bay Area community, and to this community that you've built. I honestly don't know of anything like it, and it's remarkable how Manny's has become such a center for positive change in San Francisco and the Bay Area community. So thanks not only to you, but to the over 100 folks joining us on the Zoom on this important topic. Let me introduce myself and then turn over to Gabby, and then we can sort of get into the state of play. Like you said, my name is Peter Ambler. I'm an Oakland resident. I am the executive director and co-founder of Giffords, which is the gun violence prevention organization founded by Gabby. I am a couple of other things. I'm a native Texan. I'm from El Paso, where I grew up, in another community that has seen, had a grievous experience with gun violence. I spent a career working in Congress. I worked for Gabby when she got shot. My colleague, Dave Zimmerman, was murdered. Gabby was grievously injured. Other of my colleagues were shot as well. And in the aftermath of the Sandy Hook shooting nearly 10 years ago, we came together to launch Giffords, which is a national organization of about 70 or 80 staff, with a large office here in San Francisco that works on policy, litigation, lobbying, and elections and campaigns, along with organizing many communities across the country, all aimed at addressing the epidemic of gun violence that we've seen. And we are gutted. We are devastated by what happened in Uvalde 2 days ago. But let me pause there, and Gabby, let me turn it over to you. If you could introduce yourself to this community here at Manny's.
Hello, I'm Gabby Giffords. I'm from Tucson, Arizona. January 8th, 2011 changed my life forever. I was a congresswoman. I was shot in my head while meeting with my constituents. I couldn't walk. I couldn't talk. I watched gun violence destroy too many lives. After the shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School, I said, enough is enough. I founded a group called Giffords. We are on a mission to end gun violence.
Thank you, Gabby. Can you just share, this is a raw time for all Americans, for parents. I'm the father of two little girls, ages 5 and 1. But it's, it's incomprehensible what folks in Uvalde are going through. I know, gun violence claimed 45,000 lives in 2020. So sadly, the tragedy in Uvalde is not unique. But how are you feeling? How are you processing what's happened over the past couple of days? Gabby?
Okay. I'm sad.
Yeah.
I'm sad. Children in terrible, terrible. Too many lives, too many guns, too many guns.
Yeah. So I mean, I think this is a good point. Like if we take a step back and look at the sort of state of play. What happened in Uvalde was an 18-year-old assailant, soon after his 18th birthday, purchased 2 AR-15 rifles and used them very, shortly thereafter to, wound his grandmother and then perpetrate the massacre at the elementary school in Uvalde. As evidenced by your participation here, that has catalyzed a wave of anger and sadness and concern across the country, a wave that pays no attention to typical divisions around geography or partisanship. I think in this moment we are all Americans, and we are all devastated and mad as hell. At Giffords, we are working constantly to engage with Congress and the White House. So right now, here's what we would say. We're working with the White House to advance not only executive actions, but sort of pressure on Congress to act. Members of Congress in the Senate are working very, very hard, including obviously Gabby's husband, Mark, in order to figure out a path forward and to see what we can possibly do to, one, get people on the record. Are you in favor of solutions, or are you willing to let this carnage continue in America unabated? And 2, hopefully get an actual solution to gun violence passed. They are working right now on what a path forward might look like. They will go into recess for the Memorial Day week and then reconvene the week after next in Washington, D.C. And what Leader Schumer, Senator Murphy, who's taking the lead on this effort, and other allied senators, including both Democrats and Republicans, have indicated is that they're going to be working to put something together. Yeah, background checks, extreme risk protection laws, minimum age restrictions for assault weapons, anything that will do something to help us stop the gun violence in this country, to take this situation where we have these massacres occurring again and again and again, where we have a situation where gun violence is the leading cause of death for children in this country, where you look at any child in your house, in your neighborhood, and where we have to know that the most likely way that that kid is going to die is from a bullet. And that is disgusting, and that is unacceptable. And what has been committed to us is that the week after next, there will be votes in the Senate.
Got it. So week after next, there will be votes in the Senate. I have a couple questions for you, Gabby and Peter, for either of you. And then for folks in the audience, this is meant also to be a Q&A. So if there are questions, please type it in the chat now. Real quick, you've talked already about the state of play with the legislation in the Senate. It sounds like you're still kind of cobbling it together, what specifically will be in there, but you're saying there'll be votes in the next few weeks. I'm going to ask you how people can help get that across the finish line, of course. But what do you, in your research, what are you seeing as the main cause of this surge in gun violence that we're seeing recently? What's causing it?
Our research is, pretty definitive. And if you
NRA.
the NRA and their obstinacy and their corruption, certainly the gun lobby's work. And over the past 2 years, you've had these sort of twin threats of, societal dislocation brought on by COVID, one, and two, too many guns paired with too few gun laws. We are running a natural experiment in this country about what happens when you have, too many guns and too few gun laws. Other countries have like lots of guns in civilian hands, but they have effective gun laws. Here we don't, which is why we have 25 times the rate of gun violence that other industrialized countries have.
Got it. So too many guns in the NRA. SCOTUS, the Supreme Court, a lot of people have been asking me about the upcoming docket. What are you worried about? What are the cases that might come through and how might it affect this issue?
There's a case called Bruin, which was set to be decided in the coming months, involving New York State's concealed carry laws. The NRA has sued on that. We are very concerned with this court that it could have a negative impact on our ability, specifically here in California, to pass gun laws that are going to protect us in the most effective ways. But we have been working for years to ensure that the outcome is as manageable for communities in the 7 or 8 states that'll sort of potentially be affected. And we believe that through our robust litigation efforts and through our efforts to work with state legislatures here in California, in New York, and other places, that if there are laws that are struck down, we'll be able to work to pass new ones that'll provide, hopefully, similar levels of protection.
Okay, back to legislation in particular. I think a lot of folks see these tragedies, and even yesterday there was someone at my space that was like, there's nothing we can do about it. Like if someone wants to get a gun and kill someone, they'll get a gun and kill someone. So do you mind, for those of us that aren't really sure what what legal tools can actually work to help prevent gun violence? What are those tools? Like, what do we know actually works that aren't currently in place, so that when we're talking about it to our friends or at the dinner table, we can say, actually, we know that these certain laws work. We just need to get them passed.
Gabby, what would you say? What is your top policy priority?
Background checks.
Yeah, background checks is a fantastic example. Over the past 10 years, we've helped pass universal background checks in enough states of over the country, throughout the country, that leads to half the American population living in a place that has the protection of universal background check requirement. In addition, of course, to many, many other gun laws. We passed 466 gun laws at the state level over the past decade. And if you look at the data, you know that 2 things. One, those laws are effective. California has a gun violence rate that is significantly lower than a state like Texas, right? And that is because even though there are plenty of guns in circulation in California, we have laws that mandate that they are sold and used responsibly. So you have proof that gun laws like universal background checks, extremist protection laws, and others are effective. You look at the extremist protection law, which we passed for the first time across the country in California here in 2016. There is now research that shows that for every 10 red flags, every 10 risk protection orders issued, there is 1 life saved. That is an extremely effective bang for your buck when it comes to preventing gun violence. And then you look at public opinion. We know that these are more popular than virtually any other piece of legislation out there. I'm not even being hyperbolic, right? Like, Gabby, what would you put that on par with? Universal background checks is similar to what?
Ice cream, free money and ice cream.
There's literally a poll that polled the sort of top things in the country, and it's background checks, free money, and ice cream. Like these
in terms of what's popular and what people
what's popular. Now you look at gun violence prevention is not a divisive issue. It is one of the only things that actually brings Americans together. And unfortunately, we have a devilish, extreme, ideologically rigid and corrupt special interest in the gun lobby that has charted a minoritarian strategy bent on bending Republican senators to their will in just a small number of primaries in states across the country. And that has so far obstructed progress, but we can overcome that.
Okay, I just have a few more questions, then I want to get to audience questions. One, you mentioned the NRA, and I remember when we were working on same-sex marriage, we had a bunch of very, very powerful special interests fighting against it, and we were able to, amplify the voices of our community and try to really fight back with our own advocacy groups. So I know that the NRA is hosting their annual conference in Houston this year, which is kind of strange and sad. What can be done to counter the entrenched political power of the NRA? What is the strategy to kind of fight against how much power and influence that they do have right now?
That's an excellent question. I would say two things. One, we beat them at their own game. We build a political and advocacy infrastructure that rival and exceeds their influence in lobbying and elections. And we have in many ways done that. We outspend them in many elections now. I think, a continuing problem is their influence in Republican primaries. But in terms of what's happened over the past 10 years, we have made significant progress there. The other thing is more cultural. The NRA and other elements of the gun lobby claim to speak for all American gun owners. And we know that that is the furthest thing from the truth. And Gabby Giffords, right there on your screen, she decided to get involved, to raise her hand, to make this her life's work, not just because she was a survivor of gun violence, but because she was a gun owner herself, who had owned and lived among guns in a state like Arizona for her entire life.
Tombstone.
Gabby represented Tombstone, Arizona in Congress, the town too tough to die. And what she has done over the past few years is traveled around the country, launching an organization called Gun Owners for Safety, which is the rival organization to the NRA. And when the NRA convenes in Houston tomorrow, with the governor of Texas, who has presided over 4 or 5 of the worst mass shootings in American history, they're going to be met by a group of Texas gun owners for safety that Gabby Giffords organized.
Nice.
Who are going to send the message that as the NRA has gotten more extreme, more ideologically rigid, and more corrupt, that has left a broad coalition of regular old gun owners, ordinary people who simply want to pursue gun ownership in a safe and responsible way, and are as sickened by tragedies like those occurred in Uvalde and Buffalo as all we are. That's all.
Right. I mean, the way I see it is like, if you want to own a gun to protect yourself or in case you need it, okay, like there should be a path for you to be able to own a gun. You should be able to have one, but like, why does anyone need an AR-15 or hundreds of rounds of ammo? Why should an 18-year-old be able to buy a gun, for God's sakes? That's way too young to own a gun. Why should anyone not have to pass multiple rounds of background checks? So this idea of like eliminating gun ownership, I mean, I'm not against it, but I can understand why people would want to own a gun, but there's got to be more limits to all these different kinds of things. And we see the same kind of gun being used again and again and again in all these mass shootings. So in my opinion, young people shouldn't be able to own it. You need to pass lots of background checks. You shouldn't be able to get them online. You shouldn't be able to cross state lines and buy a gun and bring it back to California. And we shouldn't have people being able to buy war weapons and use them privately.
Manny, you're making too much sense. It's here in California, we have an assault weapons ban. We have a minimum age requirement. If you're an 18-year-old, you look at Buffalo and Uvalde, both were perpetrated by 18-year-olds. Their brains are literally different than your brain is just a few years later. It makes you more impulsive, more prone to violence. And it is just common sense that we keep these weapons of war out of the hands of folks like that. And any parent, any American should agree with that. And you look at the polling, they do. It's just these Republicans in Congress corrupted by the gun lobby that are digging their heels in.
Got it. My last question to you all is kind of more an emotional reaction to, both you or Gabby, or both of you, if you'd like. Kind of, how does it feel? The two of you are some of the top leaders on this issue, right? You run Giffords, which is one of the largest organizations devoted to ending gun violence. And Gabby, you in your physical body, you represent what's at stake in this issue. You survived. You almost died being shot by a gun. What does it feel for you to wake up and be working on this issue and see that this continues to happen again and again without major legislative action happening at the federal level? How does that feel? And what has your reaction been to that?
Move ahead. Do not look back.
Move ahead.
Move ahead and not look back.
Yes.
There's a new documentary coming out in over the next couple of months by the directors of RBG called Gabby Giffords Won't Back Down. And it tells the remarkable story of Gabby's recovery from being shot. And you see her work tirelessly, like to fight for her life, to fight for the ability, as she said, to walk again, to talk again. And Gabby always points out, right? She didn't make this progress overnight. There was no like innovative medical procedure that was invented that led to her recovery. There was no there was not a breakthrough speech therapy session. It was Gabby putting her head down day in, day out, doing the tens of thousands of hours of work to move our country forward. And Manny, you mentioned the marriage equality movement. There's a sense, I think, that change has happened so quickly, all of a sudden, almost spontaneously. But for those that were in the fight for so many years, like they know that social change happened after decades of courageous leadership and advocacy by the people primarily affected. And that is going to be true for gun violence prevention as well.
Okay.
It's about building a movement and, like Gabby said, saying, move ahead.
Don't look back. Okay, Nancy asks about executive action and orders. White House, what can the Biden administration do by executive order? What power do they have on this issue?
That's a great question. If the Senate refuses to pass universal background checks into law, the administration can actually do a lot to narrow these loopholes in the background check system. And they can do that like this. The ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, part of the Department of Justice, under the law is able to define what it means, quote unquote, being engaged in the business of selling guns. Now, if you're engaged in the business, you're required to register as a federal firearms licensee and conduct background checks in any firearms transactions. So what we're telling this Department of Justice to do is to set a common sense limit, 2 guns, 5 guns a year transacted, that would then require a federal firearms license and a pursuant background check on that transaction. And that could have a dramatic effect at pushing unlicensed, no background check sales and transactions out of the unregulated, unlicensed market and into the regulated system, which requires background checks and will keep us all safer.
Got it. Next question comes from, actually a few people have asked this already, which is kind of, how have the politics changed? And is there an opportunity to get Republicans to support gun safety legislation? So can you talk a little bit about the opportunities to get Republicans on board for this? There are, I think, three or four questions, folks being like, come on, what about the Republicans?
Yeah, Gabby and I have talked about this. I worked in Congress for nearly a decade. Gabby served in Congress for over 5 years. During that time, neither one of us were ever once lobbied by a representative of a gun violence prevention organization. Whereas today, Giffords and other advocates out lobbies the NRA in Congress. It used to be, before Gabby was shot, before Sandy Hook, before we launched Giffords, and there was this sort of national movement, that even the Democratic Party was divided. You had great advocates in the Democratic Party, but half of them would just knew that were more NRA Democrats, and even the supporters knew part of the deal was that the NRA was the only game in town, and they got to define the debate. That's
Right.
no longer true. So that has changed. And if you think about politics in very simply, an issue that divides your base and unifies my base is going to be a political winner, and that's what guns does. It unifies Democrats. It helps convert Republicans and independents into Democrats, and it divides Republicans between an extreme, ideologically far right, rigid base and the sort of more suburban, moderate types that they actually need to build national coalition. So that's what has changed. We've won this national argument, but we have these minoritarian power structures in place that prevent progress on this and many other issues.
Got it. There's been a few questions, Gabby and Peter, about mental health. We keep hearing about this. We don't want to stigmatize mental health, since that is an NRA talking point. And we know people with mental illness are not inherently more dangerous than anyone else, but are there policy solutions to prevent people in crisis from getting guns in particular?
Yeah, if you look at
Lockdown.
Yeah, the guy that shot Gabby was mentally ill, and there are policies that would better help prevent acts like that from happening in the future. If you look at the extreme risk protection law, right? I mentioned that early. That is modeled on domestic violence restraining orders, and it allows people in society, family members, school officials, law enforcement, to identify folks who are at a risk, who are in crisis, who are at a risk potentially of committing harm against themselves or others, and go and temporarily restrain that individual's access to firearms. And like I noted before, that's an extremely effective law. Of course, it also requires a more comprehensive background check system, so that individual cannot bypass that law.
Got it. Okay, a kind of a very specific political question, and then we'll close up. And it does feel like, these tragedies happen. There's this outpouring of support and of sadness. Manny's is doing a vigil in a few hours outside our business with the faces and the names of these children who were murdered. People get very upset, and then the next issue comes up, and it's like almost like we forget about it until there's the next shooting. There's a question from Teresa about kind of what needs to happen, within the actual politics to get the bills passed, specifically ending the filibuster, issues with Manchin and Sinema, and potentially putting major media pressure on Manchin and Sinema to end the filibuster so that we can pass legislation without waiting for 10 more Republican senators, which, let's be honest, it just feels like, how are we going to, there's no map that gives us 10 Republican Senate votes on this, is what people feel. So what do you think about that strategy, and what's the response to that?
Absolutely. If you look at the filibuster and you look at how Republicans have entrenched themselves in a sort of small number of states, you look at 40 states. Georgia, it could represent 13% of the population, and we need to win more Senate seats, right? 50-50, it's hard to get anything done, even with filibuster reform. And we need to not just think so narrowly about getting the filibuster now, though obviously you bring down the threshold of votes required, it's going to make things easier. I think if we had a 55 vote requirement instead of a 60 vote requirement, for example, we could get something done much more easily than today than we might be able to do otherwise. Even though I do think that there's still a chance of progress with 60 votes. But we also need to re-elect Warnock. We need to. Gabby was just in Georgia with Stacey Abrams. We're supporting Beto O'Rourke. It's not just federal. we have made enormous strides at the state level as well, electing leaders and putting policies in place to protect folks.
Thank you for that. And thank you for packing so much into 30 minutes. I wanted to give Congresswoman Gabby Giffords and Peter the chance to do kind of the final words, and then I'm going to close us out. So why don't we start with you, Congresswoman?
Our lives can change so quickly. Mine did when I was shot. But I never gave hope. I chose to make a new start, to move ahead, to not look back. I'm relearning so many things, how to walk, how to talk, and I'm fighting to make the country safer. It can be so difficult. Losses hurt. Setbacks are hard. But I tell myself, move ahead. I'm finding joy in small things, ride my bike, playing the French horn, going to the gym, laughing with friends. The small things add up. We are living in challenging time, but we are up for the challenge. My own recovery has taken years. Many, many people have helped me along the way, and I learned so much. I learned when people care for each other and work together, progress is possible. A better world is possible. But change doesn't happen overnight, and we can't do it alone. Join me, let's move ahead together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabby. It's just so amazing to hear your voice and to see you on our screens. And like we were reminiscing before this call in our little chat beforehand, you were, of course, the last event at Manny's before the pandemic, the last big event. We celebrated Super Tuesday together in February 2020. So I'm sorry that we have to see each other under these circumstances, but I think I speak for everyone on this call when just seeing you and hearing from you gives me a dose of hope. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Peter.
Let me end on the question of hope. The NRA sells guns, but they have their two most effective products are one, anger, which helps them, and fear, which help them sell guns, and hopelessness, which is their primary political weapon. Their only hope is that Americans will give up hope. They want you to think that gun violence is a naturally occurring phenomenon, like a hurricane or an earthquake, that we have to blame mental health, poverty, bad parenting, bad schools, social media, movies, video games, anything but guns and weak gun laws. When obviously in this country, we're running this natural experiment of what happens when you pair the two together. But here's what makes me hopeful. One, when we pass gun laws, we know that they're effective, and Americans are increasingly learning that. Two, they're very, very popular. Three, though there are many guns in circulation, which sometimes makes the problem seem difficult to solve, in reality, the vast majority of those millions of guns are owned by a small and shrinking percentage of the American population. And if you look at the firearms that are used to actually commit crimes, what's called the quote unquote time to crime is typically very short, meaning that new gun laws work. If you stop firearms trafficking, if you pass universal background checks, if you invest in community-based intervention solutions, we can have immediate impacts on these gun violence rates. And the last thing I would say is something that the last questioner mentioned, right? It's this sense of, tumult of, us sort of, going from one outrage to another. But I want to assure you that yes, there are, peaks and valleys in this sort of, generational fight against gun violence. But every time there is a act like this, a terrible tragedy that spurs tens of millions of folks to get involved and get angry. Yes, sometimes people move on to something else, but we always make our base and our infrastructure bigger and stronger and more effective. Manny, you and your community are a wonderful example of that. You know, we know each other because of this issue, and we come together to support organizations like Giffords and leaders like Gabby because not just what happened in Uvalde, but because of your longstanding commitment and your community's longstanding commitment to safer gun laws.
Thank you so much, Peter. I'd like to ask everyone in the audience to take a second and just send your notes of love and encouragement to Gabby so that she can see them. Gabby right now is at the center of this issue, and she's spending all day in her organization giving speeches like this and encouraging people to get involved. So I ask you to maybe write some things in the chat for her to see so that us here in the Bay Area can send her some love and some encouragement and some strength, which is what we do. So please send some notes. I'm seeing them come into you, Gabby, about how you're inspiring, how you're amazing, how we all love you, and we do, and you know that we love you out here in the Bay. I know that it can feel really, really overwhelming. You read these reports, you see the faces of these children, and you think, there's just nothing I can do about it. That is not what Manny's is about. That is not what we in the Bay Area are about. That's not what we stand for. There are things you can do. You can call members of Congress's office. You can call senators' offices. As soon as that bill that Peter was talking about that gets cobbled together gets put out in the press, let us all commit to doing our part to trying to get it over the finish line. You can pressure folks to end the filibuster. And one thing you can do today, right now, is you can donate. Donating actually helps. The NRA is extremely well funded. They have tens of thousands of members all over the country, paying monthly, paying dues, giving them what they need to do this advocacy. We need to have twice, 3 times, quadruple the amount of strength of the NRA, and to do that requires funds. So you'll all get a link to donate if you RSVP'd on Eventbrite. I'm also putting the link in the chat. Click it, donate the most that you can, support the work of Giffords, support the work of their subsidiary organization, Gun Owners for Safety. I think that's super smart. And I'm sending you some love and strength for the rest of the day. Tomorrow at 5:30 p.m., if you're in San Francisco, we will be having a vigil outside of Manny's for both the shootings of the Buffalo shooting and the Texas shooting. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you so much, both Peter and Congresswoman Giffords, for your time and sending you love and strength. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you, Manny.